Good morning, everybody. Hello. Oh my goodness. There's so many of you guys here. Hello. If you are new here, welcome to my channel. My name is Dustin, and this channel, Modern Metaphysicate, is about all things esoteric and occult related. If you are returning, thank you so much for coming back to hang out. Today, we are doing a tarot deep dive, and so what that means is we are going to explore the evolution and history of one of the major arcana cards of the tarot. If you jump into the description box down below, you will find a link to the accompanying blog post to this video. Down there, you'll also find links to my social media where you can reach out and connect, as well as a link to my personal website where you can book a tarot reading with me. As always, down there you'll also find a link to the playlist for this entire series. And today we are deep diving into the Hermit. So I hope everyone has a nice cup of coffee, tea, or in some places on the other side of the world, maybe a glass of wine, as someone was mentioning in chat, and snuggle up with a blanket or have the window open if it's summertime. And grab your favorite Hermit card, because we're going to dive into the history and evolution of this card. So yeah, everybody's talking about getting ice cream for breakfast, which I fully approve of. Cake, ice cream, all of those things for breakfast, go for it. You have the whole day to burn those calories. Frozen yogurt, equally as delicious. A frog in my throat. So, it's so good to see all of you here. Oh my goodness, there's so many of you guys here. I am going to throw a link in chat to the blog. So if you do want to follow around, be sure follow around. If you do want to follow along, you can do so. And you can always just head over to my website, and it will look a little something like this. And if you scroll down to the bottom, you'll see the 3 most recent blog posts, or if you click on blog, you will find it. So here's our Hermit blog, and I will throw this in the chat for everybody who wants to follow along. So that's there now. It's also in the description box if you're watching this in the future. But yeah, we're going to talk about the Hermit, which is my life path card. Ironically enough. For those of you who don't know what your life path card or your birth card is, it's basically you add up the digits of your birthday, and then you correlate that to the major arcana cards, and it is supposed to unlock secrets for you, and give you insights into your personality and things like that. And the Hermit card is very fitting for me. I will say that. I have coffee with after 8 creamer. I don't know what that is. I have a vanilla latte. That's what we're doing in the ye old world Marseille cup. Good morning. Also, if you have any questions during this live stream, be sure to do at Modern Metaphysicate in chat. That will highlight it nice and bright for me on my screen so I don't miss it, or put it in all caps. If I do miss it, just keep posting your question or your comment that you want me to see. Sometimes chat can get a little crazy, and I can miss things. So I'm not ignoring you. I probably honestly just missed it. So feel free to keep posting it. And if you have a question and you're watching this in future times, drop it in the comment section below. So let's dive in. The Hermit. Barb, and while you have Dustin's webpage up on your PC, you might as well add it to your favorites bar. It's a good idea. So, yeah, the Hermit. The Hermit is a fun trope, right? He's existed in literature basically since the dawn of civilization. We've had Hermit-type characters in every form of religious literature, to, Victorian romance novels, to modern day references like Yoda in Star Wars, right? And the Hermit really is, he is that character, he's that outcast, sometimes self-inflicted, right? He's maybe a little antisocial, maybe a little socially stunted, as I like to say. And he kind of lives alone, or she lives alone, on the fringes of society, by their own choice, right? Or you have the exiled hermit, which is basically the other flavor. So we get kind of a light and dark duality within the hermit as a trope. So, with the light side, you get those self-exiled, self-recluses, self-imposed recluses like Gandalf and Yoda and Merlin and figures like that. They often align with the trope of like the guru hermit, or which basically is the figure that our heroes like to go to for training or for inspiration, or to garner some secret knowledge that the hermit has figured out in their time alone, right? And then the other sort of hermit character that we see pop up quite often is sort of the more malicious type of hermit, where they are exiled from society. So society has forced them out. And usually this causes some sort of strife or tension, and they become a villain, be it on purpose or not. And we see that in figures like the Phantom of the Opera is actually one of my favorite sort of darker side hermit characters, right? Because when we think about the Phantom of the Opera, he was a hermit. He basically lived in the sewers underneath the opera house and mastered his art of music, and was feared by society because he was disfigured, and did some not so nice things. And we see that in figures like Gollum as well, right? Gollum from Lord of the Rings is a hermit. He chooses to live alone, stowed away within the Misty Mountains to spend time with the One Ring, because that is his precious, and he doesn't want to be around anyone else, because we know he did some not so nice things to get it, right? So hermits come in kind of those two big flavors when it comes to the literary history of this sort of archetype and trope. And really, when we think about it, right, if you think about, Joseph Campbell's sort of arc of the hero, right, which if you are not familiar with Joseph Campbell and you have any remote interest in mythology, please go out and read Joseph Campbell. He is amazing. But the hermit is often the character that heroes or individuals seek out for occult. And when I use the word occult right now, I'm using it in the literal sense of the word, meaning obscure or hidden occult knowledge, right? So they go to them to learn something, to kind of be transformed. And even if we look at the hermit and his place within the major arcana of the tarot, right, he falls at the very end of that first septenary. He's in the beginning of the second, right, where our hero, the Fool, begins his inward journey, right? He's no longer dealing with other characters, right? The hermit kind of is the last of that. So yeah, Joseph Campbell's voice is very soothing too. Yes, if you are an audiobook fan, Joseph Campbell has audiobooks of his own work, and it's amazing. Very, very true. Don't forget the modern middle-aged woman who lives alone with her cats because she likes them better than people. Not talking about yourself, of course. Of course. I mean, I'm the modern, almost middle-aged man who lives alone with his cats because I don't generally like people all that much. So yeah, no, I feel you. I feel you, Barb. So yeah, I mean, as far as a trope, right? Again, with this series, one of the things that I want to drive home is that the hermit is a long-standing character within sort of the lattice of society and of literature and of civilization itself, right? just like all of the rest of the tarot, which is why, right, it is in the Major Arcana. Let's see. Han M has a question. So what is the difference between the Hermit's wisdom and the Hierophant's wisdom? Can the Hierophant be, could have been the Hermit at one point? Yes. There is a strong relationship between the Hierophant and the Hermit. And in some cases, right, the Hierophant and the Hermit and the Magician are referred to as the three magi. So those three together, right, can represent the three magi in terms of like Christian traditions. And they all kind of represent their own thing. So all three of those figures are very, there is a through line there. You are absolutely right. And the major difference, between the Hermit and the Hierophant, the Hierophant is a teacher, right? Being the Pope, right? He professes, he is the embodiment of tradition and of teaching, of going out and teaching people, of preaching, right? Whereas the Hermit is a recluse and people go to the Hermit. That's kind of one of the big differences. Fix the Life podcast says the Hermit is an enlightened Hierophant ? I wouldn't say that the Hermit is more or less wise than the Hierophant. They just represent different understandings of knowledge, right? Both of them do have a religious undertone to them, and we'll get into that here in a little bit. But, not necessarily one knows more things than the other. The Hermit, in terms of a literary trope, typically knew more occult things, right? When we think about, Yoda in Star Wars, he lived on Dagobah, the fringes of society in Star Wars, because he, his belief system, the Force, the Jedi way, was not in vogue with the Empire, right? And so he put himself in outcast, one, because he felt like he failed, right? So it was a self-imposed exile, and two, because he continued to study and master the Force, right? But when we think about Yoda in the prequel films, right, he is much more the Hierophant, right? When he is teaching the younglings in the Jedi Temple, he is the Hierophant, right? But when he's on Dagobah, he is the Hermit. So that's a really good analogy. I'm totally being a nerd here, and I hope you guys love it. All right. So, Kate, down at the bottom of the blog post, which I'll post again because a number of people have joined the video already, down in the blog post at the very, very bottom, I always list all of my references. So if you're interested in any of the books that I use to put these presentations together with, down there you will see them. Be the Infinity says Obi-Wan kind of became a hermit as well. Yes, absolutely. In fact, you see Obi-Wan, the arc of Obi-Wan as a character within the Star Wars universe, right? We see him start out as the fool, and then he becomes the magician, and then he becomes the Hierophant, right? When he takes on Anakin as his apprentice, and then he becomes the hermit when he exiles himself to Tatooine to watch over Luke Skywalker. So yeah, I mean, those characters can embody that sort of arc that we see within these characters or these tropes within the tarot. So I think that's a great analogy. All right, so we've kind of talked about it as a trope, right, as a literary thing, but hermits have been a thing, right? They've always been a thing. Historically, they've existed for a long time. Usually, it was a person who put themselves into exile to live an ascetic life, meaning that they wanted to live a very highly religiously structured life, In fact, the term or the word hermit derives from Greek and Latin words meaning from the desert, basically. So these were people that literally went out into the desert. And interestingly enough, one of the funnest facts about hermits that I know that blew my mind when I was in art school is talking about how so at the beginning of the 16th century. Um, This is really fun. So at the beginning of the 16th century, the aristocracy had this sort of like bizarre fascination with hermits. And it didn't really become highly popular until sort of the 18th century. But you see this tradition of noblemen and aristocrats and wealthy folk of Europe and England, and it happened quite a lot actually in England, France, and Germany, respectively, of them basically building little hermitages or little sort of like follies, which if you don't know what a folly is, it's like a ornamental fake ruin, right? They would build little like fake Roman ruins on their property because it was fashionable. And what they would do is they would hire someone to live on their estate as a hermit, and they would pay them. And oftentimes their jobs required them to do ridiculous things like, not speak to anyone, not cut their hair or their nails. We have existing documentation of like job postings of these aristocrats looking for people to basically be in what is known as an ornamental hermit on their estates. And so, they would dress in rags and they would, hunt for themselves and forage for themselves off of the estate. And they would live in like a little hovel on the estate grounds, and the aristocrats would literally host like garden parties where they would bring all their friends over to watch the hermit and things like that. What I have on the screen right now is an engraving of an ornamental hermit from the late 18th century in Germany, right? And this was very fashionable. Like if you were of a person of notoriety and you had an estate, you had a hermit that people would like go and look at, like it was a zoo. I'm just catching up on chat here. Lisa says perhaps a Star Wars tarot video is needed. Star Wars is a perfect example of sort of the heroic arc that Joseph Campbell outlines, and in fact you can apply that directly to the tarot. That would be a fun video. Maybe. That's a lot of work though. Oh no, cases that you're recuperating from a fractured back, and I've been looking forward to this live. Oh, I'm so sorry. I hope you get better soon. That sounds painful. Owie. As a child, I always wanted to be someone's aristocrat's hermit living in their folly. I was devastated when I found out that was no longer a thing. Yeah, right? So funny. But yeah, this was a thing. And so, we can see that this sort of character, this person, right, has had a lasting impact on as an archetype, right, within society and within literature, within fashions, within religion, right? It permeates all layers of civilization, is the point that I do want to make with this. They're fun though, right? And there's great little engravings and things like that of these people, and great little stories too. And in fact, there's one well-known story where basically this aristocrat hired a gentleman to be his hermit, and it was like a week on, and he had an unexpected visitor, and he went out to show his friend who stopped by his hermit, and he wasn't there. And so he sent people out looking for him, worried that he had gotten lost or was injured in the forest or whatever. And they found him at the pub drinking. And so he fired him because he wasn't staying in character. Just hysterical stuff like that. That like today when we look at it, we're like, what? But this was serious business. Like if you were going to be a hermit, you could not go to the pub. Okay, so let's dive into a little bit more of the actual origin of hermits and hermits that we see today, that still exist today, right? So we have hermits, figures, people who are hermits that still exist to this today. They're always often associated with religious asceticism, which is, again, a desire to live a very religiously doctrined life, one that you typically, 9 times out of 10, renounces worldly goods, pleasures, all that kind of stuff, right? You see this in all the major religions in the world today, whether it is Christianity or Hinduism or Buddhism, right? Those are kind of 3 major religions right now that we see people still choosing to live a hermited life. You know, historically, the Catholic Church encouraged this, and in fact, they would, you had convents and monasteries, which were one thing, which was people living a more aesthetic life, but living very communally. And you also had hermitages where people who would live in a community of other hermits. So they would live as a hermit just with other people who were also living as a hermit in a kind of bigger space. And the Catholic Church encouraged this, right? The sort of big image of the hermit that we see quite often today is that of a sadhu in Hinduism, which is their sort of term for a hermit, right? And this is someone who practices sadhana, which is a deeply disciplined spiritual path. Now, a lot of times these are yogis. It doesn't necessarily mean that they are always yogis, and they can also be women. There's asceticism, I think is how you say it. If I'm mispronouncing these terms, I'm deeply apologetic. I tried to research how to say them correctly, but I am not a native. But they live as one would expect a hermit to live, for the reasons that we think of hermits living that way, right? To gain spiritual enlightenment, to understand themselves. They live on the fringes of society. They usually give up all their worldly goods, etc., 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 right? And it still exists today, to this very day. Yes, sadhana equals bliss. Yep. So it is a tradition, a long-standing tradition that still happens. And in fact, there are like famous hermits today. There's a guy who lives on the top of like a giant stone pillar kind of off the coast of the ocean, who only comes down like once a month to get supplies. There are famous, very wealthy people who live hermited lives in some regard. There are, in fact, there's popular culture based on this, right? Alone, the game show where they literally drop people off in the middle of the wilderness to watch how they survive, is in fact an expression of what being a hermit is, right? And they have to like film themselves, and whoever survives the longest wins money. And so, yeah, this tradition, this archetype, this trope, right, has existed since the dawn of time and will continue to exist well into the future. And that is why it is ingrained in the Major Arcana. When we think about the Major Arcana, right, it is these big, huge concepts that are universal to the human experience, right? Whether you are from the West or the East, whatever shade of pink, brown, or green your skin is, right? It doesn't matter. It is universal to the human condition. And that is really what the Major Arcana represents, are these universal truths to the human condition, right? No matter who you are, where you're from, these are things that you will find and or experience. Okay. Reminds me of Into the Wild. Yes. So again, one of those major archetypes, which is why we find it within the tarot. Now let's dive into the visual evolution of the cards. We're going to start here with the Visconti Sforza, which is widely considered to be one of the oldest complete, and I use air quotes because we've pieced together some decks and different sources to make it complete. And I'm not going to dive into all of that, but if you're interested in it, you should definitely go check it out. There's lots of great research and books on that. At some point, I do want to do tarot, like historical tarot deck videos on the channel, and go through a lot of like the Dodal and the Visconti Sforza, and talk about Swiss and Besançon and all that kind of stuff. But we're gonna start here, just to look at one of the earlier depictions of the Hermit. And here we see this robed figure with a staff or a walking stick. He's got a really sweet hat. Can we talk about this man's hat? I mean, it is pretty freaking awesome. But he's holding an hourglass, which is a little bit of a departure, and we'll talk about this here a little bit more in a bit. But the depiction of him is pretty standard to what we know today. If you're familiar with the tarot right now and you're holding on to a Rider-Waite Smith deck, you're probably like, hey, this is pretty standard. And as we move forward into time, right? Interestingly enough, I did have a comment about like, why does the art get worse? And so for those of you who don't know, the Visconti Sforza deck is a deck. It is earlier than a lot of our Marseille friends, because it was a hand-painted, hand-gilt piece of work. An artist was commissioned to literally paint all of these little cards by hand, make them by hand, and then they were used by the nobles in Italy. When we move forward into time and tarot has become more popular and the middle class starts using it, that's when we get into Marseille decks and things like that, which were produced in mass, right? They were the mass market decks of the time using woodblock printing, which is why the art becomes much more simplified, right? Because all of this was printed with wood blocks and stencils and painted with stencils. That's why the colors are often shown as big blocks. And a lot of times too, when you look at classic Marseille decks or historical facsimiles, right, you see that the coloring goes out of the line because it was just a stencil. It was mass produced, right? They were making tons of these decks to sell. But when we move into the Marseille a little bit later down the road, right, we see the same traditional thing, right? Old bearded man in robe with walking stick holding lantern. Nothing crazy, right? In fact, the color of the robe is the same. And interestingly enough, that stays true, right? When we get to Pappas, our dear friend Pappas, who is probably the most well-known source of saying that the tarot comes from ancient Egypt, which we know is not true, but he perpetuated that. Here again, we have the same thing. Now, he's basically holding what's known as an oil lamp in this case. But again, bearded old man, blue robes, walking stick. It's a little hard to see, but there is a little bit of a walking stick. It's just like a black line facing the left, right? I had to look up Saturnine for anyone who didn't know what that means. Slowly and yep, exactly. Thanks, Barb. Our Isaac says, I can't imagine how expensive they must have been by being painted by hand, so precious. Yeah, absolutely. That is why, and when we're talking about the Visconti Sforza too, you know, this area in the background here, that was gold leaf. It was not. Is right. You can still see this in museums today. Very expensive. And then we go mass market because it's popular, right? Pappas, who is one of the first to start using the tarot in an occult way, right, continues this tradition. We see it continue on. By the time we get to Arthur Edward Waite and Pamela Coleman Smith, not much has changed. The blue's kind of gray now, but we have the big blue sky in the background. But again, we still have that hooded old man with a walking stick facing the left with a lantern. Now in this card, they do add a little bit more esotericism by making the lantern contain a 6-pointed star, or the Star of David, or the Seal of Solomon, for example. And we'll get into that when we talk a little bit about the symbolism within this card. But so far, pretty much the same thing, right? And then when we get to our dear friend Aleister Crowley, more of the same, right? We still have, of course, a more abstracted and modern and things like that. But again, robed old man. This time the robe is red, so we do have a little bit of a color change here. But robed old man holding lantern, right? Facing the left, right? Now, there's no official sort of reason why we don't have any first primary source material in regards to why the Hermit faced left. A lot of people think that's like a representation of his inward thinking, right? His self-reflection, sort of that thing. Looking back at the past to understand the future, etc., etc. But we don't really have any primary source material examples of why that is. So we can look at art history, right? And a lot of times when people faced the left, right? For example, when we're talking about art history, and this is, someday I'll write a book on this, I promise you guys, just not yet. When we talk about art history, you see a painting where something is on the edge of a table, right? That is done purposefully, right, to represent certain things within the narrative of the painting. So we can look at art historically. Why did people face the left? A lot of times you have figures facing the left when it is dealing with like past things, or people who are deceased, or looking to the past, things like that. So that's a common sort of thing. Did Crowley do his own artwork, or did he commission someone? He commissioned someone. He worked with Lady Frida Harris, is the artist of the Thoth Tarot. So she doesn't seem to get as much notoriety as Pamela Coleman Smith, but she definitely got more notoriety in the day than Pamela Coleman Smith did. And in fact, they had quite the relationship when it came to making the deck. There's a lot of letters and things like that of them going back and forth about the cards and how they were choosing to depict them. So yeah. So I mean, in terms of the visual evolution of this card, right, we can see that it really hasn't changed much over the years. It's changed very little. In fact, it's one of the most unchanged Major Arcana cards within the tarot. It's very traditionally depicted. It's very rare to see this sort of archetype changed in any way, shape, or form. Even in very modern decks. Let's just grab a deck for funsies. Let's grab we'll grab this. This is my current obsession for those of you who are interested. This deck is the Curious Travels Tarot deck. It was a Kickstarter. It is being picked up by US Games, I think, and it is being mass produced. So, but it is my current obsession. Let's find the Hermit. Here we go. So again, now in this case we don't see that it's an old man, but we still have that robed figure with a walking stick holding a lantern, right? With a star, right? So even in very, very modern, I mean, this deck literally just came out, we still see that same traditional depiction. And this deck is very non-traditional when it comes to a lot of the cards. You know, I mean, here, for example, is a depiction of justice. So it's one of those cards that just seems to be perfect in terms of its the way it's depicted. Okay. So that's the visual evolution. Let's talk a little bit about how it evolved in meaning, right? So our earliest friend Du Mallet from 1781, right, was very simple. The old man. We get to Levi in 1855. There's a typo there. Gasp. I am a human. We'll fix that after this. The Hermit, right? The sage in search of justice. Mathers, the Hermit, prudence, caution, deliberation. The Golden Dawn in 1896, whose titles are always just fab. I mean, the Golden Dawn titles are delicious. Like, this is just the epitome of over the top, right? The Magus of the Voice of Light, the Prophet of the Gods. The Hermit or Prophet, wisdom sought of and obtained from above. In the mystic titles, this with the Hierophant and the Magician are the three magi, right? We talked about this a little bit earlier, right? And again, with the idea of the prophet, right? Moses, right? The figure of Moses is a hermit, right? When we think about him, he starts out as the fool, kind of goes into the magician through his time in as an Egyptian, right? Then becomes kind of a hermit, becomes kind of a hierophant, then kind of becomes hermit, right? So another good example of this sort of archetype character trope. So then when we get to Waite, right, he titles it the Hermit. Keywords are prudence, circumspection. Interestingly enough, also treason, roguery, and corruption, which is interesting. Like, Waite always throws a wrench, right? And it's so funny to me because so many decks are based off of A.E. Waite and his imagery and his sort of thesis on the tarot in Pictorial Key. But nobody talks about that side of the card, right? Like, that doesn't come up in modern decks. But that was a part of the card in his regard, right? Treason, roguery, and corruption. And so that is, again, reflecting that long-standing tradition that we talked about earlier on when it came to the literary history of this archetype and trope, right? Of sort of the evil side of the hermit, right? The Phantom of the Opera, the Gollum hermit, okay? And this is a perfect example of how being a tarot reader isn't just about learning one keyword or anything like that, and how context in tarot reading is key, right? When you're reading a tarot card, it's not about just learning the meaning of the cards. It's about what the tarot card means in the context of the spread that you're using, in the context of the other cards that are within that spread, and the context of the cards that are not within that spread, right? And being able to weave all of that together, that is what makes a good tarot reader. Okay. Then when we get to Crowley, who is never short on words, because bless his heart, the card recalls the legend of Persephone, and herein is a dogma. Concealed within Mercury is a light which pervades all parts of the universe equally. One of his titles is Psychopompus, the guide of the soul through the lower regions. These symbols are indicated by his serpent wand, which is actually growing out of the abyss, and is the spermazotune developed as a poison and manifesting the fetus. Following him is Cerberus, the three-headed hound of hell, whom he has tamed. In this trump is shown the entire mystery of life, its most secret workings. Yod phallus spermazotune hand logos virgin. This is perfect identity, not merely equivalence of the extremes, the manifestation, and the method. That's intense. Right? There's a lot to unpack there. Yeah, there is a lot to unpack there, right? But he dives into basically how the hermit is representing, the great alchemy, in this case, right? And there's a lot of symbolism when we look at this card, right? You have Cerberus, right? You have the little spermy guy, right, which is the staff. You have the Orphic egg up at the top here, right? You have the lantern with the sun, right? There's a lot going on here, right? There's the wheat or the barley or the grain. Lot of symbols. Okay. So that is how it's evolved over time. Now we can see in terms of the meaning of the card, it stayed pretty true, right? There's a couple of outliers, but in terms of this card, right, it represents it often in tarot represents the guru hermit, right? The figure that we go to learn something from. You get that sense of like inner guidance and light and things like that. But you get Crowley with his everything's about sex. You get Waite with his very strong everything is made of light and dark. But other than that, it's pretty straightforward. Lisa, oh boy, quote, the little sperm. That's what it is, Lisa. That's what it is. Oh my goodness. When I first saw the Hermit card, I see Gandalf the Grey. Yeah, absolutely, Moon Empath. We talked about that a little bit earlier in terms of the archetype, but Gandalf the Grey is a great example of the Hermit. Let's hope that I use that book when I write my... Let's hope I use that terminology when I write my book. Oh goodness. Oh, thank you, Michelle. Okay, so let's dive into the symbols, right? Let's talk about the symbolism. And symbolism is important when we talk about the tarot, okay? And when we do this section, we always use the Rider-Waite Smith. Maybe at some point we'll do this with the Thoth. I don't know. We'll see. Who knows? But let's break it down. There's not a lot going on in this card, right? Hooded old man, facing left, holding staff, lantern, standing on top of a mountain. There's not a lot to break down here. So let's talk about the staff, right? The staff is a symbol of knowledge, power, and authority, right? We see it commonly associated with pilgrims, saints, and prophets such as Moses, right? Pretty straightforward. Obviously, we have that sort of reference to staves or wands within the Minor Arcana, but the staff is associated with all those things. And when you think about pilgrims, saints, and prophets, right, most of them were hermits, right? Whether it was Moses or Jesus or whomever, Buddha, right? Buddha kind of was a hermit for a while before he became a prophet, right, of sorts. All of those figures kind of go through that arc, that story arc that we were talking about earlier. The lantern and the star, right? The lantern shines a light on inner truth and wisdom, guiding the hermit out of darkness, right? That's kind of the vibe that we get. Now, when we're talking about the earliest depictions of this card, right? The only thing that shifted was it went from having the hermit went from carrying a an hourglass, right, to a lantern. And the hourglass, oftentimes in art history, just represents time, the passage of time. Okay. So I did want to touch on that briefly, but in terms of the lantern, right, it's that guiding light. Okay. Now the star, again, the star to which is emanating the light can represent a few things, right? It can and a lot of people feel like this represents the great alchemy. It's the six-pointed star in alchemy represents the union of opposites and the epitome of as above, so below. So you get that kind of, again, that arc, that story arc of the magician, the Hierophant, the Hermit, right? It's also known as the Seal of Solomon or the Star of David, and the star represents the spiritual power and knowledge that the hermit has, right? He's literally carrying, like, look at all the spiritual knowledge and power that I have, right? Because, again, the Seal of Solomon was an emblem emblazoned onto a ring in which King David was able to control demons in order to build the Great Temple, right? He controlled demons to build the Great Temple. Sink that in for a minute. Once more for the kids in the back. He controlled demons with a ring to build a Great Temple with the Seal of Solomon, right? And we see that reflected within this card, right? And then last but not least, right, we have the mountain precipice, right? He's standing on top of sort of a little precipice, right? Check him out. He's got nice shoes. But the mountain precipice, right, represents a few things, right? But in general, it represents all of the things that he's learned. He's overcome all of the challenges and obstacles to reach the pinnacle of his knowledge, right, and his understanding of self. Okay. That's why he's on top, literally on top of the mountain. That's why the mountains are so tiny, right? He's literally standing at the very top, and you have all this blue sky, and then you have the mountains just at his feet, right? And we talked about, way at the beginning of the start of this series, right, we talked about general symbolism. We did a video on color theory in the tarot. There's also the elements, symbolic representations of the elements within the tarot. And we talked specifically about mountains in one of those. And so I do want to link that. I linked it in the blog post. I'm going to link it in chat right now as well. But if you are interested in the symbolic meaning of mountains within the tarot, go check out my video and blog post about symbols of earth within the tarot. All right. And that's really about it. The end, right? The robe, oftentimes, again, we have no first primary source material with regards to the robe, right? The robe has kind of existed since the beginning. You can dive into symbolism of robes all you want, but at the end of the day, it's like a really comfortable piece of clothes, and it's easy to wear and maintain. That's my theory on it. So yeah, that's our hermit. He's a pretty cool guy. He hasn't changed much in the history of tarot. The symbolism is pretty straightforward. It draws directly from the sort of social consciousness of literature and archetypes and tropes that we see through religion, civilization, and literature through all time, through to today. And not much has changed. He is one of the most unchanged figures within the tarot, Major Arcana, for sure. Are there any questions? Do we have any questions? How are we doing on time, by the way? Oh, look at that, 55 minutes. Oh, I'm so good. Right at an hour. I feel like I've heard or read somewhere that the Hermit is associated with Father Time. There is a connection with Father Time in terms of a lot of the ancient Italian decks. That is definitely a possibility. And that is one of the things that they associate with those cards that we see him holding the hourglass. So yes, that is correct, Princess What's Her Name. Be the infinity, one ring to rule them all. I support wearing spring kimonos. Dude, you know, robes are awesome. I just want to say that. Like robes are awesome. We should bring them back. Pants suck. Oh, thank you, Lisa. Yeah, don't forget to smash the thumbs up. But I hope all of you guys enjoyed this. Again, if you are interested in this kind of thing, numerology. We haven't talked a whole lot about numerology. I wanted to leave numerology out of this because I have plans to do numerology in something else. The only card that we've really talked about numerology in is strength, because strength and justice are swapped. But we'll talk about numerology later. In terms of numerology, we don't see numerology come into a part of tarot until the modern period, right? It really isn't until like Papus and forward that we see numerology considered. And really this is specifically more about the history of it. So yeah. What do I have hanging behind me? So these right here are the last set of herbs from my garden. So I have that before, we had hard freezes. So I have mint, and then rosemary, and then we have 2 bundles of sage, parsley, thyme. That's what's behind me. So yeah. For all the witchy things. Perfect. All right, I don't see many questions. We'll start to do our little wrap up here. If you have questions, throw them in chat. There is a little bit of a delay, but again, if you have any questions about this at all, feel free to leave them in the comment section later. If you're watching this in the future, down in the description box below, you'll also find a link to the playlist for this entire series. So if you want to deep dive into the other Major Arcana cards, we've done the Fool all the way up to the Hermit now, so you can go back and watch those. On my website, you'll also find accompanying blog posts to each and every one of those, and you'll find a link to this one down in the description box. And you can find the videos from each of those blog posts as well. The herbs in the back are really making me want to play Skyrim. That's awesome. So yeah, be sure to check the description box for all of the details. You'll find all my social media links down there, as well as a link to my website where you can book a reading with me. You can purchase some of my own handmade metaphysical goods, etc., etc. So yeah, thank you all for coming to hang out and dive into Hermit. I hope everyone learned something today. And again, if you do have any questions or anything like that that pop up in your head, drop a comment down below. If you're watching this in the future, let me know what your favorite Hermit card is from your favorite deck, because I always find that fascinating. And in fact, I've found lots of decks that I've wanted to add to my collection from those sorts of comments. So please feel free to do that. If you're watching it live right now, come back and drop a comment down below and let me know what your favorite Hermit card is. So yeah. Thank you all so much for hanging out today. I hope all of you have an amazing, amazing Sunday. And always remember that everyone is fighting a battle that you know nothing about. So be kind, always. Bye, everybody.